is the beauty of a new museum. We've had technical problems this morning, so bear with us. Now? Now? Okay, I'll do it like this, I think. Yes, so I'm very happy to welcome you all in this great new museum, which was inaugurated yesterday. It's a great star in the sky of Qatar, and I'm very honored to be moderating this panel today on what great museums are. We are now in a very, very great museum, and we have the amazing opportunity to meet leading world art figures, directors from leading world art museums. And I would like to start by introducing Béatrice Lecars from she's the director of the Musée d'Orsay, which probably most of you know as the house of the most important Impressionist painting and post-Impressionist painting in France. She's a specialist on 19th century and is director of this museum since 2 years. She worked there as curator before, and in fact it's not only the Musée d'Orsay, it's also the Orangerie with a very famous Monet panels which belongs to it, and also the Musée Hébert. So please welcome Béatrice Lecars. Then I would like to introduce Sir John Layton from Edinburgh. He's the director of the Scottish National Museum, so that's another national museum. And it is an amazing museum. It's actually it's a merger of two museums. One of the museums which houses the important collection on Scotland, Scottish antiquities, and Scottish cultural heritage. And also it has another branch which was merged into, which is to do a lot with science and nature. So it corresponds very much to our museum here. John Layton, in fact, is a specialist on Van Gogh. He's long worked in Amsterdam as director of the museum there. He's been teaching art history and is a graduate from Edinburgh University. I would like to, as I just learned. I don't think I have to introduce Her Excellency Sheikh Yasser, who is the star of Qatar Museums. And of course, she's the chairperson of Qatar Museums, and it is behind her the vision of this museum and all the other museums. And really, I don't have to introduce her. We are extremely honored to have you on board and very looking forward to discuss with her. I want to continue with Adam Weinberg, who is the director of the Whitney Museum, so now something completely different. This is for contemporary modern art and contemporary art of America. It's, you know, it's the cultural place if you want to learn and know about American art. This is where you go. They had a huge museum not very far from the Metropolitan Museum, and not so long ago actually changed to the meat packing area into a spectacular new building. And we probably will hear more about this very soon. And then it's a great honor to introduce Professor Mikhail Piotrowski, who is probably the longest director here in our round. He's the director of the Hermitage, which of course is a museum everyone knows here. It's a very old history, and it has seen many changes over many, many centuries, and we are really interested to hear more about this, how these changes evolved and what is the Hermitage today. Professor Piotrowski, by training, in fact, is an Arabist and did Oriental studies. He excavated widely in the Yemen and Caucasus, and also in Central Asia, so he is also a colleague of mine, which is very nice. He has received many awards, and he is probably the only museum director who has a planet named after him, which is rather impressive. So, well, I welcome you all here, and we welcome also Professor Piotrowski. And of course, we are here today to speak about great museums. What are great museums? What were they in the past? What are they now? And I would like to start with Her Excellency Sheikh Yasser, with the question, what makes a museum great? What is it you think is great when you come to a museum? Which are the great museums or the museums you adore?
I think what I look for in a museum, for me to think that it's great or not, is how the architecture has a relationship with the galleries or the museography inside the architecture, but also the landscape. So the visitor experience for us is very important in developing this museum, as you should have seen or will see, hopefully. But when I personally go to museums, I always look and think about how the architecture has a relationship with its environment and how the collections are engaging the audience in terms of not just aesthetically, but also engaging them from an educational point of view, because one has to assume the average visitor to your museum may know nothing about your history or culture, and how to empower them with knowledge after that experience. So for me, that's what really makes a great museum, in terms of how the architecture, landscape, and collection all work together to enhance the visitor experience.
Professor Piotrowski, maybe you can elaborate a little bit.
Well, certainly what makes a museum great is, first of all, reputation. And what we have to work to have a good reputation, it makes us all great. But it's very modern side of it. But the general side is certainly collection. Collection makes museum great. Great collection, and then how you manage this collection. And how you manage this collection, how you study it. The scholarship is another very important part. And how you manage how to present it to the people, and how you fit it into, it's absolutely right what you was been telling about the architecture. Architecture is a history. Well, for instance, the Hermitage consists of different buildings, of different architectural styles, but it's also different periods of Russian history. So in a way, great European and Eastern and Western art is in the box of Russian history, which is architecture and memory of events. So altogether, perfectly presented, makes us great. You have to present what you have in different ways so that people will be fascinated, maybe not only by what you have, but how you handle it, and how fascinating is the work of museum curator and keeper. All the mysteries which you can discover on the stars of your collection which you can present. And so it's a big job, but I think each museum has succeeded in this.
Mr. Weinberg.
Let's see, is this working here? Yeah. For me, and I agree with both of my colleagues here, but the word that comes to mind for me is the word relevance. And obviously with kind of sense of bringing people together, and if the building and the environment doesn't connect to something really meaningful and deep, but in the end, it's people come for a need to connect to something that's really meaningful. And I don't mean relevance in the sense of just news and the idea that it's just information, but relevance in ways that it can be deep and complex, contradictory, but something that has an urgency to it, because we've all gone to museums that have great collections that people don't feel an urgency to go to, and then some museums that might not even have great collections but can create a kind of context that has an urgency. So if you can bring all of those things together, that people feel compelled to come to the museum for some kind of deeper engagement, whether it's a transcendental or a political or a personal or psychological, that to me is what makes a great museum, is the great works of art, the great buildings and the great context, together with an urgency of the way the displays and the programs are presented.
John Layton, why would the National Museum of Scotland be relevant?
Well, you can see what's going to happen here. We're going to sit and agree with one another. And maybe before we go into the question, I think it's really important to say that something fantastic is happening here. And we may not agree what a great museum is, but I think something great has been done here in Doha, so I just want to say congratulations to you. Relevance is obviously crucial, but I don't think there is a magic formula for greatness. You can list all the ingredients, collection, a great story to tell, the passion and enthusiasm and knowledge of the people who are involved, the engagement of the audience, all these things, the setting, the architecture that you mentioned, Excellency. But somehow it's in the mix and the balance of all these that something happens. There's a certain magic that is, and I don't want to dodge the question, but it's something indefinable. And greatness comes through that, I think. And I think we touched on another important point. There are some wonderful large museums that attract fantastic numbers of visitors, but they can offer these days a pretty miserable experience. They're overcrowded, the interpretation is not great, there's a certain dehumanization because there's so many people coming through. So size doesn't necessarily equate with greatness, and I think there's more of an emphasis now on the actual experience of the visitor. But you certainly will remember how you felt when you visited a place, and I think that's becoming increasingly important.
I think it's your turn now, and how would you see that from a French
Difficult
perspective?
to add anything. No, I would go in John's path in saying that I think very special because you have a 19th century building, whole success of the Musée d'Orsay. But what has changed in the museum world over the last probably 30 years is that we now put at the center of things the visitor's experience. I think it's a big preoccupation for any museum directors in the world, and and that's something that changes a little bit the parameters from what used to be a museum, which was a collection kept in a certain place, displayed in a certain way, and without really questioning the way people were reacting to this collection. This has completely changed, and we see here today, with the opening of this wonderful museum, that the visitor's experience is at the center of the purpose of this museum. Everything is built around the museum, the visitor's experience. So that, and probably for the audience of today, connected to social media, connected, who can answer immediately, we can talk to the institution directly in a way. It's very, very important, and that's probably what makes museum great today, is the way you feel, inside the museum, the way you experience your visit, the way you will remember it, foremost, probably.
How does the education play in? I think education as such was always an important part in a museum. No, it was to educate people. But what is it educating today? I mean, Professor Piotrowski, especially for the Hermitage, I mean, how does it, what is the purpose of the education, actually?
I think there are different ways and different aspects of education. One is in general, you have to educate, to tell people about art history, or about culture, which is more important than art, about your own culture and so on. But one is which is important exactly for today in the universal museums, how to explain to people that every culture is different, but these cultures must be in dialogue. Dialogue is a beautiful word. Everybody uses it, dialogue of cultures, dialogue of cultures. But if you don't have the dialogue of cultures, you had wars of memories. If you just present different things, everybody, there'll be discussion. This country is better than other. This art is better than other. This was taken from this country to another country. This was part of this country or another. 3 millennia before, these countries didn't exist. Why you write this on the label? There could be a lot of discussions if we don't bring these different things together and explain how beautiful it is that they are different. How beautiful it is that you can explain them in some common things. I want to show it. I have this on my desk, one of manifestos, which was signed and done in Florence last year. It was also signed by also by your institution, the Museum of Islamic Art. There are different things about this war of memories and dialogue of cultures, and one thing which we have to pay attention, all the museums. Now all the museums are visited by people from all different countries, all over the world, different cultures. We were talking in Florence in the main church in Florence and in the museum, and discussing the great numbers of Chinese tourists coming to see Florence. To what degree have you to tell them about the religious meaning of the art which you have? Well, it is in Florence or Museum of Islamic Art or whatever. To what level you speak about this beauty, and to what you have to explain also some of the philosophical religious meanings, not to overdo it, not to overcome it. It's very clean with the Catholic art and Christian art. To what degree do you speak about the story of the God and man and flesh and so on, and different theological descriptions? The same thing comes with we speak about Islamic art. To what degree, certainly and Islamic art, we call it Islamic art, not like we don't call Christian art, we call it Islamic art. There are a lot of things which are together, a lot of differences, but to what degree you have to explain that it is, let's say, manifestation of some great religious ideas, and to what degree you speak about the beautiful of this. It's different things. You have to educate people, sometimes with provocation maybe. You have permanent display which is more or less balanced, and you can make exhibitions which will provocate people to think what is good, what is bad, what is beautiful, what was the history. Or for instance, when you tell the story of different conquests in the history. For instance, in our Russian history, there have been Russia, there have been Tatars and Mongol, the Golden Horde. Now we are opening a big exhibition of the Golden Horde done by Hermitage in Kazan, in Hermitage Kazan, in our branch in Kazan, where we want to find this balance, how to speak about with the people who have been 1,000 years ago in different political unities, fighting each other, how you now can speak to them as about things which are common history, common knowledge, and their common history, common heritage. That's another part of education. Another part of education, which is extremely important now, is about the heritage and who owns the heritage. It's okay, everybody knows, well, each country has rights to have the heritage, and it's your heritage. But it's one important thing. Each heritage is the heritage of the world. It means that if it's your heritage, it doesn't mean you can destroy your own heritage if you don't like it. We know it in Syria. We have seen it in Russia when they have been destroying churches after the revolution because it's heritage, but we don't like this heritage. We have to have a new one, a new heritage, a new future. But important thing is the heritage belongs to everybody, to the world. You can cherish it, you can take care of it, but you have no right to destroy even if you don't like your own heritage, because for other people's heritage it's clear. So there are some things which we... Thank you. These are different ways of whom do you educate and how do you educate people, and it changes. It changes every 10 years, I think.
Yeah, I'd like to come to Adam now, because of course he has a very different type of museum with contemporary art, a lot of artists coming. Now it's part of your program, living artists, contemporary artists, so it's very different. You know, that's today. You know, Hermitage is, is archaeology. So what is your educational aspect? If you probably engage more in discussions, you need... are you tackling sort of the modern world and the youth, for example?
First of all, the Whitney Museum was founded by an artist, and so we always put the artist and the maker at the center of everything. It's the idea that objects are created by people, and that's actually, in a way, what makes them most miraculous, because we look at these things on the walls, or on the floors, or wherever they might be, or all around us, and somehow we disconnect as human beings the fact that these amazing objects are produced by people, and that to me is sort of a miracle. And I think a little bit, what John was saying is, what do you take away from the experience we're doing? Yes, we hope they're informed and they learn and there's interpretation and all of that, but what is the experience that you have with the object or the objects in it? And you know, the old line that, you know, if an artist wanted to say what a work meant, they would just write down on the wall. There would be no reason to make the work of art. And our job is to try to, on some level, remove the barriers between the making, the object, and the person who is looking, and not to add more layers to it. I mean, I think that is one of the successful things that happens in the museum here, is it is about experience. It's about walking into the galleries and about having an experience, whether the experience is through the objects or through the video. And you know, one of the things I find really remarkable is that sense of the kind of flow of time as you go through these video spaces. And one of the things I'm also really struck by is my first time in this part of the world, frankly, but the idea that, you know, the sense of the desert sands and the sense of things changing and moving in a culture that is constantly appearing, disappearing, and ephemeral, being presented through video, it is about the experience and what do you take away. And these artifacts that are embedded in that experience are only one part of it, because memory is created through the connection with objects and with makers. Sort of a long answer to a very long question.
Her Excellency?
Well, Adam, I hope it's not your last time to be in this region, but no, I agree with everything that's been said. I think that's why this museum in particular is very different from the Islamic Art Museum. It's very different from Madhaf. It's a museum for the people of Qatar, for the people living in Qatar, for the visitors, and it's all about Qatar and what memory will these visitors have when they leave the experience. And one of the ideas for us was that as a 21st century museum, this should be an imaging museum whereby as a visitor you get a snapshot of Qatar through this experience, and then you would explore Qatar outside the museum walls. And the playground, which we will officially inaugurate in the fall of this year, also will add another element of education and engagement for children. And again, the National Museum is very different to the Islamic art. Are you okay? Salaam. So it's very different from the Islamic Art Museum. The National Museum are very different because after a few galleries here at the National Museum, you'll find the children's area where children can engage. And we went back and forth with the designers of the children sections and Jean Nouvel, who saw that this was almost an interruption of the experience, whereas we thought it was really important to highlight the educational element and the repetition of information, because children learn at a slower pace or faster, whichever way you see it. But it was important for us to go down to their level in terms of touching things, interacting. There's a lot of interactivity because you know, all our children are high tech, better than me at least. So it was really important for us, and I think when children leave, there'll be opportunities for them to continue the educational learning. When teachers come here, they'll be inspired in terms of getting material and integrating that in their curriculum and methods of teaching, which today is very different to when I was even a child. So I would re-emphasize the visitor experience as the fundamental part of our planning, especially in this region. I think it's really important.
Yes, may I turn to Scotland again? And does this, you know, how is this from a regional perspective now? I would quite like a comment now. Was, you know, is because you have, of course, this is Scottish, is Scotland in England? How does this relate to the present political situation with, you know?
Scotland in England.
Sorry. With an Irish director. Coming from Königsberg. Yes. So how could you elaborate on that?
It's a great question. I mean, the problem with sitting on these panels is I sit here and I think I wish I'd said that. Now I'm thinking, I'm sitting here and thinking I wish I'd done that with all the things that you just described, Excellency. I think I couldn't agree more. You're taking us now into, I suppose, the territory of local, national, and international with regard to with museums, and that could give us subject for the whole morning. I'll make a few sweeping statements that you could challenge, and it seems to me that a great museum will probably have a resonance that crosses all of those, local, regional, national, and international. I think deeply something is rooted in its local culture, tradition, and history, unless it has a national and international outlook. I think it will also seem limited and parochial. So it's not easy always to get the balance and mix between those. I think your question also takes us into another territory of it's not just what the museum is about, it's who's the museum for. Which audience are you prioritizing? Is it a local audience, which will have one set of interests and one set of needs, and maybe will become a repeat audience that will want to come back many, many times? Or is it a rather fickle tourist audience that might come just once? And so what are you doing for them? And then it also takes us into perhaps more uneasy territory of to what extent museums are telling stories about forging identity. And whose story are you telling? How are you telling it? And these are great subjects. Just to round this one off, you asked about Scotland, and of course I'm head of a museum which has the word national in it. And national is a term which can become charged with different meanings. It can mean something of national and outstanding international significance. But it can also mean different things to different people. So that, for example, in a Scottish context, where you have one part of our nation wanting to become independent and not in England, as you put it, and another part that wants to remain very firmly part of United Kingdom, then the word national means two very different things to those communities. And so as a museum, you have to handle these different stories. You have to provide a forum for debate. You can't ignore it. You're part of that wider discussion, but you have to handle it with great sensitivity so that you don't become part of the story yourself. And that's not always easy to do.
But would you not want to be part of the story sometimes?
I'm sorry?
Would you not like to be part of the story sometimes?
Well, part of the story in the sense that you shouldn't be seen to be taking sides. If you become too overtly identified with one political viewpoint, then you're at risk of excluding a whole set of other viewpoints. And I think as museums, we offer layered narratives. There are often in issues of identity, politics, there are often no simple monolithic stories, and you have to give room to that, and it's not always easy.
Beatrice Lecars, Monet, Cézanne, in Paris now with the Yellow Vests.
Yes.
What is there a connection?
Direct connection, I'm not sure. No, what is important, I think, is Orsay is a national museum. And in France, our political history of the French Revolution and out of a republican ideal. So museums are very much political institutions in France. For instance, I was appointed by the President of the Republic. You know, I don't think that any American museum directors is appointed, nationally speaking. This is the way France sees it. We have a Minister of Culture, which is also tells a lot about our vision of culture. And as a national institution, we have a policy, for instance, of sending works and sharing our collection on all the territory of France, as we have an international policy that is part also of a diplomatic policy of France. So we are in France very much used to this question of culture and politics in a way. It doesn't mean that it's an easy answer and you have to adapt to the realities of society. France is going through a crisis right now, absolutely no question about it. I'm just noticing that culture is not really part of a debate right now. For a reason that everything's focused on the economic situation more than the cultural situation. So I don't know exactly what conclusion to draw out of it, but that's the reality of it. So yes, we are a national institution, not in the same maybe context as the National Gallery of Scotland, but we bear a stamp there, and we have a mission of education, of sharing with our citizens, of course, the French citizens, but with all the world, because France has also this universal ideal, of culture, and the Louvre is the perfect illustration of this kind of universal vision. And we think that, we should share this culture with all the visitors from all over the world and give them access to those collections that are not centered, say, only on French art, I must say. We are acquiring a lot of, European arts. We are open to things that are not French, so we're quite active in that field, actually.
Professor Piotrowski, what do you do to keep your museum great, or to make it even greater?
First of all, we have to work hard. We, curators, stuff. Another thing is to be more and more open. We try to be a global museum. Also, the world of globalism is not very much in fashion now in the world, but in culture, in museums, it's very important. All museums are becoming global now. We have to make museum more and more accessible. And we have some recipes of ours how to be accessible. One thing is we have a program called Great Hermitage, which is Hermitage in the world, with 3 elements. One is open storages. It's always a problem of the museums. What do you keep in your reserves and so on? We have built 2 big buildings, 6 floors, 6 stores, and we're building some more just to make the storages open so you can visit our storages to see things in a different way, not like in the museum, one painting on one wall, but many objects and many paintings and so. In a way to show what is the life of the museum, and you show the study, we have the restoration laboratory in this building so you can see it all. It's opening the inside of the museum. Another thing to open to outside, we make a lot of exhibitions, everybody, and we have Hermitage branches, centers. One of the most successful is in Amsterdam, another in Kazan in Russia. We do planning some more in Russia, and we had one in London which was closed, and we moved to Italy, and we have Hermitage Italy, and so on. So we are organizing different ways of being present as not only as collections, but as a museum. And this was also proposed. We have a system called Hermitage Days, where we make days of exchange. Hermitage Day somewhere, some museum, and day of this museum in Hermitage. We have Louvre Day in Hermitage. Next month we have Hermitage Day in the National Gallery in London. 2 weeks ago we had Hermitage Day in Oman, in Muscat. We had Day of Oman Museum in Hermitage. So we are proposing also, I propose officially to have Hermitage Week in Qatar Museums in Hermitage. It works well. It's appreciated by the people. So this presence and mobile presence all over. And the third thing, which you think accessibility, we call it forum of the museum. When you take the place around the museums and you organize different kinds of events, which are not exactly museum things, more cultural oriented, more mass oriented, more public oriented, different kinds for children, different things. Well, last time we had it in Hermitage, not exactly in the museum space, outside on the first floor of one of the buildings. The week of children's books. Then it will be some photo exhibitions which are not great photographers which are shown in the main space, but just for general public. Different kinds of things which are for the public, more social oriented, but done under influence or patronage of the museum. It must be different from the museum activities, but it must have the taste and control of museum taste. We have to bring it, our taste and our understanding what is good and bad, what is beautiful and not beautiful, to the public through different kinds of this event. And it's also a fight because we have Hermitage, we have the big Palace Square, and everybody wants to do something on this Palace Square. Just 2 days ago, we managed to push out the idea of having a fun zone of the football match of Unifa, which will be in St. Petersburg on the Palace Square. I thank God the governor 2 days ago, I've seen him in the airport, held, okay, it will not happen on the Palace Square. It's very important to show what can happen. A lot of things must be happen in the historical squares, but what kind of things can happen and what kind of things could not. It's things which museum must dictate. It's a little bit arrogant, but we are a very arrogant museum. We try to persuade the governments that we know better in many things. So this is how we try to keep us great.
Now, thank you. This is a very personal question now. What do you do if you have competition around, you know? I mean, as Museum of Islamic Art, we have this new National Museum now. What do you do with all these great other museums around the corner? I mean, you changed the location, obviously, which I will not...
You know, it does go to another one of these questions about the specificity of our museums and the relationship of the local maybe to the global as well. For me, for enough art out in the world. And I believe museums, particularly contemporary art museums, each one has its own mission, its own DNA. And when I say DNA, I'm reminded that DNA is mutable. It's not fixed. It's a constant changing. But there is a spark that is its origin story or where it begins from, and it's a story that changes over time, but each one of us in New York have a different story. The Museum of Modern Art has a very different story than the Guggenheim Museum has, and the Met has a very different story, and I think together, all of those stories, we each tell multiple stories ourselves, and then the stories that each of those institutions tell are different from each other, and I think that makes for a very good chorus, actually. But, you know, thinking about your question also about what continues to make, you know, at least our museum great, I think is that if we think about the diversity of the stories that we're telling at the Whitney, and that, you know, for many years there was this notion in American art that there was some kind of pure idea of what American was. The question that was asked at mid-century in America, what is American about American art? Looking at a few art historians here, remember that question. Now that would be the most ridiculous question to ask, and yet it was asked for 30 years. And it's what I call the artichoke theory, which was that if you believe that you peeled away the artichoke, eventually you get to the purity. And what we realize now so fully is it's all the leaves. And all those leaves we were casting off to get to the heart were all the story itself. And that story is the story of the many cultures that exist within the United States. There are over 800 languages spoken in the United States. There are thousands of indigenous tribes. There is so much that is global within the United States. That's how we can connect with the world. And actually, difference exists internally in most countries and in most situations, far more than we realize. And I was really struck and very moved by something the Emir said last night. And he talked about, there were, I think, 3 words that he used. He used decency, and that sense of respect for one another, respect of different cultures, respect of difference, diversity, which I think is something that everybody is talking about. Museums are, particularly contemporary art museums, are what I think of, and often my colleagues think of as safe spaces for unsafe ideas. This is a place where we can fight, we can argue, we can disagree, we can get angry, we can protest, and we should do all of the above. But at the same time, there has to be respect, tolerance, decency, and understanding that the different stories that we're telling in our institutions all have validity to them. And that doesn't give us the right to cut out another story because we believe in the ultimate belief in our own. And that's a very hard thing to do in this country.
May I actually jump now to Paris, because that's another one, because there are so many great museums in the city. And do you actually meet with the other directors and you make a Paris program?
It's a scoop, we talk to each other all the time, yes. Yes, of course there's competition, but not only within Paris Museum, but I mean it's an international competition. When you are dealing with modern art museums, you know, when you see what is going around with the organization of exhibition, for instance, dealing with late 19th century, early 20th century. I mean, there's a lot of pressure on its institution to have the most important show, of a year or whatever. Of course there is competition, but I don't think that it's the most important or interesting thing. Is that you have for each institution to make it exciting for the public to go, to discover, and then to come back. And I think that the question of the dynamics between the permanent collection and the temporary exhibition is extremely important. At least for Orsay, it is an extremely important ingredient of a possible success of Orsay. For instance, I just take the last two examples. We had a wonderful Picasso Blue and Rose exhibition a few months ago that was a record-breaking for Orsay in terms of attendance and I think a critical acclaim. I mean, it was the first show dedicated to the first, really the first years of Picasso as an artist, and it was a wonderful show. And we just opened a highly different show dedicated to the black model, the representation of a black female and male model in French painting from Géricault to Matisse. And this exhibition is connected to an exhibition that took place a few months ago at the Wallach Art Gallery in New York, and in a whole different display in Paris, and somehow a different approach. And it will go as a third venue to the French West Indies, to Pointe-à-Pitre in Guadeloupe. And I think that only says, what you can do with temporary exhibition within the general, institution and the permanent collection. And we do have, around this exhibition, for instance, a lot of cultural programming, performing arts, music, dance, debates, and I agree with the dam. A museum is like an agora, a forum. It should be a place where discussion is possible in respect of each other's position, but it should be alive. It should be, it is a place where you learn to respect things, even if you don't like it, if you're not a great fan of, whatever you are showing in each other's point of view. And I think that even when you're dealing with a historical collection like Orsay does, you always look at them from a contemporary point of view. And it's why I invited again contemporary artists to interact with our permanent collection and our exhibition policy. We had Julian Schnabel as a guest a few months ago. We have Glenn Ligon doing a special installation in connection with the Black Model exhibition right now. And we will be having Tracy Emin in a few months when we will have a Berthe Morisot exhibition, two female artists, one from the late 19th century, one from today, what it is to be a female artist. So it's, those things are these exciting things that you want to do with a museum today, that you want to propose to the public and hope that the public will grab it and say, oh, this interests me. I will go back to Orsay. I haven't been here, there for years, so I want to go back and see what they are doing.
Her Excellency, maybe you could elaborate a little bit about your vision for Qatar museums. Why so many museums? Why so many different museums?
Well, I think there's a narrative, and if we think about it as chapters of a book. So we opened with the Islamic Art Museum that talks about the heritage of the Islamic world, and that includes Muslims and non-Muslims and all cultures who lived through the Islamic civilization. The collection expands from Spain to China, so it's very, as you know, where we're hanging our galleries at the moment, because there are things that have been in storage and we want to allow the visitors to see, to rotate the collection. But in order to do that, we want to also expand the interpretation of the collections and how that is connected to today and how it's relevant. Adam mentioned relevance. I think that's really important for us as well, especially now as Qatar is enduring a political blockade. As all of you know, we remain relevant. Actually, we're much stronger than we ever were, and we're confident, as this museum has shown. Thank you. And then to continue on the chapters, we opened Madhaf, the Arab Museum of Modern Art, which is a partnership between Qatar Foundations and the Qatar Museums. And actually it's very significant for us because we already had the plans and foresight that we'll be building a new museum, which actually Sir John was on our jury for the International Museum of Contemporary and Modern Art, which will be, again, a restoration and renovation of our art mills. They're flour mills, and we're calling them currently an art mill. And that will, again, continue the narrative of what we've done here after Madhaf, which is a museum about Qatar, the history, the present, and the future. But there's a continuity, so once you visit the museum, you'll see there are connections in our past to our future and our present life. And we haven't changed. We're still very much connected to our heritage, to our culture, but we're embracing a contemporary narrative to compete with the rest of the world in terms of having a voice. And I really believe in complementing each other. So whatever programs we have here in Qatar that are not directly related or under Qatar Museum supervision, we complement them, whether it's a national library that opened last year with Ramkool House, or Qatar, the Culture Village that has amazing programs. And if you haven't been, I really encourage you. They've just opened the Qatar Hills and the Gallery Lafayette for any of you who needs to do some shopping. And they do a lot of great festivals. They just, I think, opening a Dhow or boat festival, which is great. It's great for families and local communities. The Ministry of Culture also does a lot of things. So it's always a narrative between what we're doing and what everyone's doing. And I think we fall under this greater vision of Qatar 2030 that's propelling us into the future, transforming our carbon economy into a knowledge-based economy. In the middle of that, we have the World Cup in 2022, which is really exciting because all the sports stadiums are also very innovative in design. We have one designed after the Gahfiya, which is a hat that all boys and men wear under their Batra Nagal, which you see Qatari men here wearing. Another one is designed after a tent, Beit al-Sha'ab. So I slipped. And you can see a lot of that in terms of how people lived as nomadic people in the desert, in the galleries here. So there's always a connection. And I'm very happy and grateful for all the support actually that we get from all these institutions. And it makes it more exciting, even though it can be challenging sometimes to coordinate all our agendas. But in the end, I think this is what the country's fabric is built upon, and I'm very humbled to be part of it.
I think I'm opening the floor now. I have missed you as the last question. John, I think maybe you can answer the first question from the public, because you would really like to open the discussion to the floor, and I think there might be quite a few questions. I mean, this is the only chance now you have these eminent art directors in front of you, so please go ahead.
Now on? Sir John, when you went from a small artist-oriented museum to a much larger one, what was the biggest surprise for you?
In Amsterdam is a single artist museum, but although it is dedicated to a single artist, we always tried to position it a little bit more broadly than that, and to see Van Gogh in the context of his time, the 19th century, and to see in terms of his influence. And I was just thinking when Laurence was talking about the temporary exhibitions and who the audiences are, that it was quite striking. The Van Gogh Museum, something like about 80% of the visitors are tourists, and about 20% are local, national Dutch people. And we always felt that that wasn't healthy, that the museum needed to be, I suppose, more important to Dutch people. And we worked against the idea that Dutch people don't really think that Van Gogh's a Dutch artist. He belongs to the world, or he's French, or whatever. So, actually, he's British. Or maybe he's Irish, Vincent O'Gogh. Yeah. But ironically, we spent probably 80% of our effort as an organization working for those 20% of those Dutch visitors with our program. So in that sense, I suppose the biggest difference for me was moving from this single artist museum, which was quite independent in its funding. Most of the money came through the ticket sales and so on and so forth. We have a state-sponsored museum with a much wider collection and with many more visitors, which I'm happy to say they've doubled in the last 10 years. Nothing perhaps to do with me, but it's good to see. And it's become, I suppose, much more political when the whole setting that we all operate in has become much more volatile. When I began my museum career, museums seemed to not change terribly much. There wasn't, it seemed, when I started the National Gallery in London, it felt, in the 20th century, it felt a little bit like you were still in the 19th century. And so much has changed in the last 10 years or so. The expectations of our audiences, the way that people travel. We haven't even touched really on the digital revolution, which has completely transformed the whole way that we think and operate at almost every activity of a museum. And I think the hardest thing that I think that we face as
whoever. Yeah, sure. Do you feel the need to upgrade to match the state-of-the-art technology that's popping up in all these new museums? Is reputation alone carrying you through?
Sorry to answer this, but I think it's a very interesting question. And as John has just mentioned, we have entered the digital age, and museums, traditional museums with, collections, works of art, are facing a challenge. And I don't think there's a perfect answer to that, but I think that we need to tackle the question in order maybe to answer the ultimate question, which is our mission is also to put, the audience in front of the original work of art. At least I think that's, for us a really important question. You want to face the real Van Gogh. You want to be in front of a real Van Gogh. It doesn't mean that you cannot do things to explain the context of Van Gogh that will deal with digital technology, And for instance, when I was appointed 2 years ago, I created a digital department in OSCE that didn't exist before, so we're not exactly, extremely modern, in that area, but and we are still, talking a lot about the real, how do you put those new technologies, the possibilities of new technologies around the actual work of art. And when you are dealing with universal masterpieces, Van Gogh's Starry Night, Van Gogh's Self-Portrait, Renoir Moulin de la Galette, or Manet Déjeuner sur l'herbe, this is very, very tricky. Very tricky, actually. And so we're working quite a definite.
Thank you.
أول شيء مبروك وشكرا. I do have my own humble addition to what make museum great as an average visitor from public. So I think that the element of surprise, either by from the collection side or the journey itself as an architectural within the architectural building, like for example in Musée du Arassi, there is the origin of the world painting that makes me act an awkward way when I was with my kids. It's like, it's not this way, it's the other way. Or for example, the clock as well in Musée du Arassi, or the floating Pinocchio in Guggenheim in New York. That was a surprising element as well, which it's these elements that awaken the inner child within us and put a smile on his face again, like the reversed pyramid in the Louvre. And today I found my spot here, how the journey ended unexpectedly outdoor and facing the old museum, the old palace, which recalled back the same experience for Musée du Croix Branly, Jacques Chirac, that you experience the building, view the building again from different perspective, and you appreciate the landscape more. And one more thing, there's that small beetle at the exit, the small tiny one. That was a really nice and smart touch. So yeah, that's it. I wonder, what do you feel about this surprise element? Thank you.
I think I'm told one more question.
Can you hear me? Just to add on what the gentleman was saying about us being spectators. So we're talking about greatness of museums. As a spectator that visited a lot of museums in my life, I have one question for all of you. And it's about when I visit a museum, I'm always occupied with trying to find information about art. Apart from the labels underneath that I have to actually go in and read very intimately, any engaging information, whether it's d'Orsay or any sort of museum I've went to. So my question is, when I speak about greatness, whether it's a person or a museum or anything, we talk about it in a form of storytelling. Storytelling is very important. It's very important in the Quran, it's important in everything. Why do museums don't take into account understanding context of everything, not just something that's individual or important? With the new museum, with the National Museum, I see it being more interactive, but I don't see it in a lot of museums, and I notice the decline of normal public visitors. And I see that partly responsible because there is actually no context sometimes, or little context rather. Thank you.
I don't know. I'm not a moderator, so it's my favorite question actually. But maybe Professor Piotrowski, you can explain about this.
It's very important. But once I returned back from one of the greatest museums in the world, telling my colleagues, they have wonderful labels with very good explanation of what is on the painting, but rather long one. And my chief designer told that, I said, well, we must do this, we must tell more, and so, and it's not easy because we have to do labels into languages and so on. He said, okay, next time you go, just look, what do the people after they read the label? I did it. They read the label and they go out. They don't look at the picture. They look at the picture before they read it and then look. So there must be a very strict balance. And now with modern technology, we know what we have to do. Not labels, nothing written, just a telephone. Yeah, then you can choose your information if you want some information, because some people need the story. Some people don't interfere in my understanding art. And the best thing is, for the visitor, I think, when he comes, he sees something, he goes back home. Oh, now you don't need to go back home. You go into the Google, and you read more information, and then you come back and look at the art and look at the objects, and formulate your own decision, because it's very important that museums, we live in the world when everybody pushes you information and decisions and so on, virtual world. Museum, it's about objective things, proper things. Let them think about it, not make people think about what we are showing, to make them possibility, to give them a possibility to choose, not from everything, to choose, but from 2 or 3 points. It's very difficult. It's very difficult. It's sometimes dangerous, but it's how it be. Story and art by itself. It's complicated, but we all work, and I think that that's why these new museums, which we have, the Gulf and this museum and the Islamic museum, so, are so important because it's a different experiences, absolutely different contexts, and we all study them with all anxiousness and being very much involved because it's a new experience of how you deal with the storytelling, showing, beauty, information, and context. Thank you.
I would just say two things. First of all, my observation has always been that people learn in very different ways from each other. Some people learn orally, some people learn by just looking, some people learn by reading, some people learn by listening, some people learn in a kinesthetic, a physical way. And it's our job within museums to offer many different avenues of ways to learn, because what works for you may not work for the person sitting next to you. And so yes, labels can be helpful. I don't read them that often myself because I would rather look at what I'm looking at and then maybe refer to it afterwards. Some people learn, as I said, by listening, and whether we do it as a gallery talk. A lot of what we try to do, since we're dealing with, I think about 70% of the artists that we show are living artists, we try to use the voices of the artists. And we have audio tours where the artists often talk about their work or sometimes about another artist's work, because I think, again, from understanding how makers think about things being made, there's something very real and physical about that. The other thing is a work of art doesn't mean just one thing. It means many, 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 many different things. So that's a complicated thing. You could look at one work of art, and we've done this. When we opened the museum, we did 100 days, 100 works of art, and we had people select a work of art, and many times and sometimes it was an artist, sometimes it was a scholar, sometimes it was a student, and sometimes they selected the same work of art, and you would hear 3 or 4 sometimes people talk about the same work of art from completely different perspectives, as if you felt like you were seeing 3 or 4 different works of art. To me, that's a mark of a great work of art, that it isn't just telling a story, but there are lots of different experiences to be had in it, and otherwise we could just simply replace it with a label.
We're trying to address here at the Islamic Art Museum with our rehanging, because when we did the installations the first time, it was purely from an aesthetic point of view with some labels. But I think now we're looking at connecting those objects with the National Museum or with our archaeological projects and putting more information. Like, I personally really love the Metropolitan Museum Islamic Art Wing because there's a lot of information, there are lots of maps, there are a lot of facts. So you're looking at the geography of where these objects are coming from. At the same time, you are learning and looking at the objects themselves. We also are very proud of our new app. I encourage all of you to download it. It's called Cultural Pass, and it has a lot of information and audio stories about the things that you could see here. It's new, so we're still playing with it, and there'll be more services that we will offer our guests, such as buying things from our gift shop or booking tables in the restaurants, etc. But there'll be a lot of information there on past exhibitions, on current exhibitions, and what you could get from the audio app. And I think a lot of museums now, I use them. When I take my children, I know they enjoy listening, the audio guides, and that can come through an app or borrowing an audio guide from the museum itself. And I think that's very engaging because you can listen to whatever, you don't have to hear everything, and you can choose what things you want to learn more from. But I personally can't read and look at the artwork at the same time, but I can hear and look. So I think it's going to always be a personal choice and preference.
Can I just add one thing?
I think we're going down the line, so it's you and
I think it is really important that we position ourselves in what people describe as the knowledge economy, and that information and knowledge are really important. But I think it's almost more important that we position ourselves in something that you might describe as the creative economy. And we have to accept that most people carry around mobile devices or computers and so on and so forth, that in the age of big data, artificial intelligence, could ever hope to acquire in a single lifetime. So to me, imagination, creativity, and inspiration are more important necessarily than the accumulation of knowledge. And I'll misquote Einstein, who said that logic will get you from A to B, but imagination will get you everywhere. And I think that's what we're about in the museum world.
Absolutely. Want to have the last word?
No, it's perfect. Yes, prepare that,
Yes.
Yeah.
Anyway, then I would like to...
No,
With Einstein, you cannot say anything
I can
anymore.
beat
Yeah.
Einstein.
Anyway, I want to thank you all very much for joining us here and for your contributions, for the discussion. I want to... And I would like to thank the audience for joining us today on the first day of the new National Museum of Qatar. So, welcome.